History's most brutal torture device was never real. The Iron Maiden stands today as the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty, a grim, human-shaped iron cabinet lined with spikes, its hinged front designed to close slowly around a living person, piercing flesh from every angle but stopping just short of killing outright. The victim would be left to bleed and suffer for hours or even days, trapped inside a cold metal sarcophagus, the spikes holding them in place while they waited for death. It's one of the most horrifying images in all of human history. A torture device so perfectly engineered for suffering that it has come to represent the entire brutality of the Middle Ages. But here's the truth. It never existed. There's a lot of debate about ancient torture devices, whether certain tools were really used or merely described in exaggerated accounts. But, in the case of the Iron Maiden, the evidence is remarkably clear. It was a complete fabrication. There are no contemporary descriptions from the medieval period, no judicial records mentioning its use, no surviving examples from before the 19th century, and no archaeological evidence whatsoever that any such device was ever built or operated in the Middle Ages. The Iron Maiden is a ghost, a powerful and terrifying ghost, but a ghost nonetheless. So where did this iconic image come from? How did a fictional device become one of the most famous torture instruments in history? And why do so many people, even today, even after historians have repeatedly debunked the myth, remain convinced that the Iron Maiden was real? The answers take us on a fascinating journey through 19th century showmanship, Enlightenment philosophy, Victorian-era propaganda, and a cultural desire to believe that the past was darker and more brutal than the present. Along the way, we'll discover that the Iron Maiden wasn't just a hoax. It was a mirror reflecting the fears and prejudices of the people who invented it. And we'll see that this single fictional device has shaped our understanding of the Middle Ages in ways that historians are still fighting to correct. The purpose of this article is to examine the Iron Maiden myth in all its dimensions, its supposed origins, the men who created it, the historical examples that were exhibited to the public, the real torture devices that have been confused with it, the reasons why the myth has been so persistent, and what this tells us about how we think about the past. By the end, you'll never look at a medieval torture museum the same way again. The device that never was. Let's begin by understanding exactly what the Iron Maiden is supposed to be. As commonly described, the device consists of a tall, upright iron cabinet, roughly the size and shape of a human body. The front consists of two hinged doors that swing open to reveal a hollow interior, and inside, the entire surface is covered with iron spikes, sharp points jutting inward from the back, the sides, the doors, and even the top and bottom. The spikes are strategically positioned so that when the doors are closed on a living person, they pierce the flesh but avoid immediately fatal wounds to vital organs. The victim would be impaled from all directions, but would survive for hours or even days, bleeding slowly, unable to move, trapped in darkness, enduring unimaginable agony until death finally came. Often, the interior was decorated to resemble the Virgin Mary, leading to the device's alternative names, the Iron Virgin, or the Virgin of Nursistum. That's the story. It's vivid, it's horrifying, and it's completely invented. Not a single contemporary document from the medieval period describes anything resembling this device. No chronicler mentions an Iron Maiden being used in any execution or torture. no judicial records listed among the tools kept in any dungeon. No artwork from the period depicts it. No surviving example can be traced back earlier than the 19th century. The first written accounts of the Iron Maiden appear in the late 1700s, long after the Middle Ages had ended, and even those early references are skeptical, often describing the device as something that supposedly existed in the distant past, rather than something the author had actually seen. The evidence for the Iron Maiden's medieval existence is non-existent, and yet the belief in it is so widespread that it has become a kind of historical fact in the popular imagination. How did that happen? The birth of a myth. Johann Philipp Siebenkees. The man most often credited with inventing the Iron Maiden myth was a German philosopher and archaeologist named Johann Philipp Siebenkees. Born in Nuremberg in 1759, Siebenkees was a serious scholar, a professor of philosophy and languages at the University of Altdorf, who had studied theology, philosophy, and philology, and who traveled extensively to Venice, Rome, and Naples to study classical antiquities. He wrote a handbook of archaeology, edited ancient texts, and was clearly an intelligent and learned man. But in 1793, Siebenkees did something that would inadvertently create one of history's most enduring hoaxes. That year, Siebenkees published a pamphlet or guidebook about the city of Nuremberg, and in it he included a remarkable story. According to Siebenkees, a coin forger had been executed in Nuremberg in 1515 using a terrible device called the Iron Maiden, a spiked coffin that impaled the victim slowly while they were still alive. It was a vivid, horrifying tale, and it fit perfectly with what 18th century readers expected of the brutal, uncivilized Middle Ages. The story was picked up by other writers, repeated, embellished, and gradually accepted as historical fact. But there's a catch. Siebenkees never claimed to have seen the Iron Maiden himself. He wasn't reporting from personal observation or from contemporary records. He was simply retelling a story, perhaps one he had heard, perhaps one he had invented. And here's the crucial point. No evidence has ever been found to corroborate his account. There are no records of a coin forger being executed in Nuremberg in 1515 by any method, let alone by an Iron Maiden. The entire story appears to have been fabricated, either by Siebenkees or by someone else whose work he was repeating. Siebenkees wasn't necessarily trying to deceive anyone. He may have been repeating a local legend that he believed to be true, or he may have been engaging in the kind of imaginative speculation that was common in 18th century antiquarian writing. Whatever his intentions, his pamphlet introduced the Iron Maiden to a wider audience, and the idea took on a life of its own. It's worth noting that Siebenkees may not have been the first to mention the Iron Maiden. The Oxford English Dictionary cites an even earlier reference in Johann Georg Kiesler's Travels Through Germany, Bohemia, Hungary, Switzerland, Italy, and Lorraine, published in 1756 to 1757. Kiesler's account is notably skeptical. He seems to doubt the device's authenticity, even as he describes it, which suggests that stories about the Iron Maiden were circulating in Germany before Siebenkees wrote his pamphlet. But it was Siebenkees who gave the myth its most influential form, a specific story, set in a specific time and place, with enough detail to make it seem credible. Siebenkees died in 1796, just 3 years after his pamphlet was published, at the age of only 36. He never knew what he had unleashed, but his account of the Iron Maiden would be quoted, reprinted, and believed for centuries to come. Matthew Peacock and the physical Iron Maiden. While Siebenkees provided the story, another man provided the object. His name was Matthew Peacock, and he was a 19th century collector and showman with a very specific agenda. Peacock spent much of the 1800s collecting paintings and, more importantly, torture devices. He was obsessed with proving that the modern era was vastly superior to the past, that civilization had progressed, that humanity had become more humane, and that the Middle Ages in particular were a dark, brutal period that modern people should feel grateful to have left behind. To make this point, Peacock wanted to assemble the most horrifying collection of torture instruments imaginable, and he wasn't above embellishing the truth to do so. Sometime in the early 19th century, Peacock created an Iron Maiden of his own. It's not clear whether he built it from scratch or assembled it from various pieces of antiquities and metalwork he had collected over the years, but the result was a physical object that looked exactly like the device described in Siebenkees' pamphlet. A tall iron cabinet with a hinged front and spikes on the inside. Peacock claimed that this was an authentic medieval torture device, and he either sold it to or displayed it in a museum, where it became an immediate sensation. This physical Iron Maiden, often called the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, was probably the most famous example of the device ever created. It was displayed in the Nuremberg Castle, or a museum in the city, and it drew crowds of visitors who came to gape at the terrifying instrument of medieval cruelty. For decades, it served as proof that the Iron Maiden was real. People could see it with their own eyes, touch it, even presumably peer inside at the spikes. What more evidence could anyone need? But the Iron Maiden of Nuremberg was a fake. It was built in the early 1800s, not in the Middle Ages, and it had never been used to torture or execute anyone. It was a prop, a piece of theatrical horror, designed to shock and entertain audiences while reinforcing a particular narrative about the superiority of the modern age. The device remained on display in Nuremberg until 1944, when it was destroyed in an Allied bombing raid during World War II. The original is gone, but reproductions, including one created from the original's designs, continue to be displayed in museums around the world. Even today, if you visit a European torture museum, you're likely to see an Iron Maiden, and the label will probably describe it as a medieval torture device. The myth lives on, the psychology of the hoax. Why did Peacock and others go to such lengths to fabricate the Iron Maiden? The answer lies in a broader cultural phenomenon that historians call dark medievalism. During the 18th and 19th centuries, European intellectuals and artists developed a fascination with the Middle Ages, but not a neutral or admiring fascination. They were interested in the period as a foil for modernity, a way of measuring how far civilization had supposedly progressed. The Middle Ages were portrayed as dark, superstitious, brutal, and cruel, while the modern era, meaning the 18th and 19th centuries, was depicted as enlightened, rational, humane, and civilized. This contrast served several purposes. It justified colonialism and imperialism by suggesting that non-European societies were medieval and therefore backward. It supported political and religious reforms by suggesting that the past was oppressive and the present was liberating, and it simply made people feel good about themselves. Torture devices played a key role in this narrative. If you could show that medieval people had used horrifying instruments like the Iron Maiden, the rack, the pair of anguish, and the brazen bull, you could make a powerful argument about how much better things were now. Torture museums, which began to appear in the 19th century, were not just collections of curiosities, they were arguments about progress, civilization, and the superiority of the modern world. The Iron Maiden was perfect for this purpose. It was visually striking, obviously cruel, and clearly pre-modern in its design and materials. It told a simple, compelling story. Once upon a time, people were so barbaric that they locked their fellow humans in spiked coffins and watched them bleed to death. Aren't you glad you live now instead of then? This narrative was so attractive that it didn't matter whether the Iron Maiden was real or not. In fact, the hoax may have been more effective than the truth would have been. Real medieval torture, while certainly brutal by modern standards, was generally less theatrical and less photogenic than the imagined devices of the 19th century. The rack, for example, was a real torture device, but it's basically just a wooden frame with ropes. It doesn't look like much. The Iron Maiden, by contrast, is visually unforgettable. It's the kind of thing that sticks in the mind and gets repeated in books, movies, and museum exhibits. What real medieval torture looked like. To understand why the Iron Maiden myth has been so persistent, it helps to understand what actual medieval torture and punishment looked like. The reality was certainly brutal, but it was also different from what most people imagine, and it rarely involved elaborate, custom-built devices. In medieval Europe, torture was generally used for two purposes: to extract confessions during criminal investigations, particularly in inquisitorial legal systems, and to punish convicted criminals. The methods varied by time and place, but they tended to be simpler and more practical than the Iron Maiden. Common methods included the rack, a wooden frame with rollers at both ends. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied to the rollers, which were then turned to stretch the body, dislocating joints and causing intense pain. The rack was real, but it was also relatively simple in design. Just ropes and wooden beams, not the elaborate iron contraptions sometimes depicted. The strappado. The victim's hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists. A weight was often added to the feet, and the victim was sometimes dropped suddenly, dislocating shoulders. Again, simple equipment, rope and a pulley. Judicial drowning. Victims were repeatedly submerged in water, sometimes with a cloth over the mouth to simulate drowning. This required nothing more than a body of water. Burning. Execution by fire was used for heretics and other serious offenders. The equipment was simply a pyre of wood. Breaking on the wheel, the victim was tied to a large wooden wheel and struck with an iron bar, breaking their bones. The body was then left on the wheel to die. The wheel was real, but it wasn't a complex machine. What's striking about this list is how simple and practical most real torture devices were. They used readily available materials, wood, rope, fire, and didn't require specialized manufacturing or elaborate mechanisms. The Iron Maiden, by contrast, is an extremely complex piece of equipment. A large iron cabinet, precisely fitted with spikes, requiring significant metalworking skill to produce. It's the kind of device that would have been expensive to build and difficult to maintain. If medieval authorities had wanted to torture people, they had much cheaper and easier options available. This contrast between the simplicity of real torture and the elaborateness of the Iron Maiden is one of the strongest arguments against the device's authenticity. The Iron Maiden looks like what someone in the 19th century imagined a medieval torture device would look like, not what medieval people actually built. The confusion with the Shandmantel. 1. Reason the Iron Maiden myth has been so persistent is that it appears to have evolved from a real, if much less dramatic, medieval punishment device. That device was called the Schandmantel German for coat of shame, or Schandton barrel of shame. The Schandmantel was a real punishment device used in Germany and other parts of Europe from at least the 13th century onward. It consisted of a wooden barrel or coat-like contraption that was placed over a convicted person and worn in public. The device was heavy, often weighted at the bottom and around the neck opening, and it was intended to humiliate the offender while also causing some physical discomfort. People who were forced to wear the Schandmantel were paraded through the streets, where they could be insulted, pelted with rotten vegetables, and generally subjected to public scorn. The Schandmantel was a form of shaming punishment, not a torture device intended to cause severe physical pain. It was used primarily for relatively minor offenses: petty theft, public drunkenness, prostitution, and the goal was to disgrace the offender, not to kill them. The device was sometimes lined with sheet metal, but it didn't have interior spikes, and it certainly didn't impale the wearer. It was uncomfortable and humiliating, but it wasn't deadly. So how did the relatively benign Schandmantel evolve into the horrifying Iron Maiden? The most likely explanation is that 19th century collectors and showmen misinterpreted surviving examples of the Schandmantel, misidentified them as torture devices, and then embellished them to make them more dramatic. The wooden barrel became an iron cabinet. The discomfort of wearing a heavy wooden coat became the agony of being impaled by spikes. The purpose of public humiliation became the purpose of slow, agonizing death. This process of misinterpretation and exaggeration was common in the 19th century. Museum curators and collectors, eager to attract visitors and make their collections seem more exciting, would often take genuine artifacts and reinterpret them in the most sensational way possible. An artifact that might have been a perfectly ordinary piece of medieval equipment could be relabeled as a torture device, complete with lurid descriptions of its supposed use. In some cases, artifacts were deliberately modified to make them look more terrifying, adding spikes where none had been, replacing wood with metal, and generally making the object look as cruel as possible. The Iron Maiden appears to be a classic example of this phenomenon. It may have originated as a misunderstanding of the Schandmantel, combined with the desire to create a spectacular museum exhibit that would draw crowds and generate revenue. Once the myth was established, it took on a life of its own, and the fake devices that were built in the 19th century became the evidence that the myth was true. Ancient precursors. Although the medieval Iron Maiden is a myth, it's worth noting that stories about spike-lined cabinets or similar devices do appear in ancient sources. These accounts are of questionable reliability, but they show that the idea of impaling someone in a box of spikes is not a purely modern invention. One of the earliest references comes from the 5th century A.D. in St. Augustine's The City of God. Augustine tells the story of Marcus Attilius Regulus, a Roman general who was captured by the Carthaginians and supposedly tortured to death by being locked inside a nail-studded box. According to the story, Regulus was forced to remain awake constantly to avoid being pierced by the nails, and he eventually died of sleep deprivation, not from the nails themselves. The story is almost certainly a legend rather than a historical account, but it shows that the image of a spike line was already in circulation during antiquity. Another ancient source comes from the Greek historian Polybius, writing around 100 BC. Polybius describes a device used by the Spartan tyrant Nabis, called the apega, after Nabis's wife. According to Polybius, Nabis constructed a mechanical likeness of his wife, complete with iron nails hidden beneath her clothing. When a citizen refused to pay taxes, Nabis would have the statue embrace the man, and hidden springs would cause the nails to pierce the victim's body, extracting confessions and money. The apega story is even more dubious than the Regulus legend. Polybius was writing decades after the events he described, and his account has the feel of propaganda designed to portray Nabis as a particularly cruel and depraved tyrant. Moreover, the mechanical technology required to build such a device would have been extraordinarily advanced for the 3rd century BC, possible in theory, but highly unlikely in practice. Most historians regard the apega as a fictional invention, created by Polybius or his sources to blacken Nabis's reputation. There is also a medieval Islamic source worth mentioning. The 9th century Abbasid vizier Ibn al-Zayyat is said to have built a wooden oven-like chest that had iron spikes for use in torture. According to the story, Ibn al-Zayyat later fell out of favor with the caliph and was himself tortured to death in his own device. This account is from a single source and is of uncertain reliability. It may be another legend designed to illustrate poetic justice rather than a factual report of an actual device. What all these ancient and medieval sources have in common is that they are isolated, unreliable, and often clearly legendary. They provide no evidence for the widespread use of spike-lined cabinets as torture devices, and they certainly don't support the claim that the Iron Maiden was a standard piece of equipment in medieval European dungeons. At most, they show that the idea of such a device existed in the imagination, an idea that would later be exploited by 19th century hoaxers to create a physical object. The Pair of Anguish, a similar hoax. The Iron Maiden is not the only fictional torture device to have been invented in the 19th century. Another notable example is the Pair of Anguish, a metal device consisting of 4 leaf-shaped segments that could be spread apart by turning a key. In torture museums and popular culture, the Pair of Anguish is described as an instrument inserted into various orifices, the mouth, vagina, or anus, and then expanded to cause excruciating pain and internal damage. It is often presented as one of the most brutal and sadistic devices of the medieval period. And, like the Iron Maiden, it's almost certainly a fake. There is no contemporary evidence that the Pair of Anguish was ever used as a torture device in the medieval period. The earliest surviving examples date from the early modern era, the 16th century or later, and their original purpose is unknown. Some historians have suggested that they might have been used for entirely non-violent purposes, such as extracting juice from fruit, or as some kind of medical instrument. The fact that the pear-shaped metal objects are found in a variety of sizes and with different mechanical mechanisms suggests that they were not standardized torture devices, but rather miscellaneous artifacts later repurposed as such. The transformation of these innocuous objects into terrifying torture instruments followed the same pattern as the Iron Maiden. In the 19th century, as fascination with medieval cruelty grew, collectors and museum curators began acquiring old metal objects and labeling them as torture devices. The pear shape was especially suggestive. It could be interpreted as an instrument of sexual torture, which added a titillating and horrifying dimension that attracted visitors. Over time, the fictional purpose of the device became fixed in the popular imagination, and today it's common to see the pear of anguish displayed in torture museums as an example of medieval brutality. But when scholars have examined these claims, they've found them wanting. The pear of anguish, like the Iron Maiden, is a product of 19th century dark medievalism, not a genuine artifact of medieval torture. The Brazen Bull, ancient myth or reality? The Brazen Bull, also known as the Bronze Bull or the Bull of Phalaris, is another famous torture device that straddles the line between history and myth. According to ancient sources, the Brazen Bull was a hollow bronze sculpture of a bull, large enough to hold a person inside. The victim was placed in the bull, and a fire was lit beneath it, heating the metal and slowly roasting the person to death. A system of pipes in the bull's head was said to convert the victim's screams into sounds resembling the bellowing of a bull. The story is associated with Phalaris, a tyrant who ruled the Greek colony of Acragas in Sicily during the 6th century BC. According to tradition, the bull was invented by a craftsman named Perillus, who presented it to Phalaris as a gift. Phalaris, horrified by the device's cruelty, ordered Perillus to be the first victim. Later, Phalaris himself would allegedly be killed in the bull when the people of Acragas rose up against him. This story comes from sources written centuries after the events they describe, and its historical accuracy is highly questionable. The Brazen Bull may be entirely mythical, a cautionary tale about the dangers of cruelty and the irony of poetic justice, rather than an actual device that ever existed. Some historians have suggested that it was invented as propaganda to blacken Phalaris's reputation or to illustrate moral lessons about tyranny. There is no archaeological evidence that such a device ever existed, and the technological claims, particularly the acoustic pipes, strain credulity. Even if the Brazen Bull did exist, it is an ancient Greek device, not a medieval one, and its connection to the Iron Maiden is tenuous at best. But its inclusion in the popular pantheon of torture devices shows how the pattern repeats across time: a sensational story, a lack of reliable evidence, and a willingness to believe the worst about people in the past. The role of torture museums. One of the most Shield, a professor of criminal law history, and philosophy of law at Bielefeld University, has argued putative Iron Maidens were pieced together from artifacts found in museums to create spectacular objects intended for commercial exhibition. In other words, museum curators took genuine medieval artifacts, which might have been parts of armor, pieces of furniture, or other mundane objects, and assembled them into Iron Maidens. Then, they displayed these composite objects as if they were authentic torture devices. This practice was common in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when torture museums were first becoming popular. There was a strong financial incentive to create dramatic exhibits. The more shocking the device, the more visitors it would attract. Museum owners could also charge higher admission fees for collections that included spectacular horrors like the Iron Maiden. In this environment, authenticity was less important than spectacle, and many devices were created or embellished to meet public demand. Even today, torture museums continue to display Iron Maidens and other dubious devices. While some museums have updated their exhibits to reflect historical scholarship, many continue to present the fakes as genuine. The Iron Maiden you see in a torture museum in Amsterdam, Prague, or Rothenburg, Ob der Tauber, is almost certainly a reproduction, a copy of a 19th century hoax. It has never been used to torture anyone, and it has no authentic connection to the medieval period. But the museum label may not tell you that. Instead, it may describe the Iron Maiden as a medieval torture device used to punish criminals, perpetuating the myth for a new generation of visitors. Why the myth persists. Given the overwhelming evidence that the Iron Maiden is a fiction, why does the myth persist? There are several reasons. First, the Iron Maiden is simply too good to give up. It's a powerful image, a terrifying, visceral symbol of cruelty that captures the imagination in a way that more accurate historical accounts cannot. Once you've seen an Iron Maiden, you don't forget it. And once you've heard the story of how it was used, it becomes part of your mental picture of the Middle Ages. Letting go of that image feels like losing something valuable, even if what you're losing is a lie. Second, the myth serves a psychological function. By believing that the past was exceptionally brutal, we reassure ourselves that the present is relatively humane. The Iron Maiden allows us to say, "Look how far we've come." It's a story of progress, of civilization, of the triumph of reason over superstition. Questioning the myth means questioning that narrative of progress, and that's uncomfortable. Third, the Iron Maiden myth is supported by a vast infrastructure of museums, books, films, and other cultural products that have a financial stake in maintaining it. Torture museums would lose much of their appeal if they admitted that their star exhibits are fakes. Publishers would sell fewer books if they debunked popular myths instead of repeating them. Filmmakers would have to find other visual shorthand for medieval cruelty if the Iron Maiden were exposed as a hoax. There's money in the myth, and that money helps keep it alive. Fourth, the myth is reinforced by the very structure of historical knowledge. Most people learn history from popular sources, museums, documentaries, historical fiction, not from academic monographs. And popular sources have been slow to catch up with the scholarly consensus. It's only in the last few decades that historians have begun to systematically debunk the Iron Maiden myth, and the results of that scholarship have not yet filtered down to the general public. Most people still believe what they've seen on TV and in museums. Fifth, there's a kind of historical inertia at work. The Iron Maiden has been presented as real for so long that questioning it feels like questioning an established fact. Even when presented with evidence that the device is a hoax, many people find it hard to accept, not because the evidence is weak, but because the contrary belief is so deeply ingrained. They've seen the Iron Maiden in museums. They've read about it in books. They've heard it mentioned in movies and TV shows. How could all of those sources be wrong? The band that took its name from a myth. One of the most ironic footnotes to the Iron Maiden story is the heavy metal band that bears its name. Iron Maiden, formed in London in 1975 by bassist Steve Harris, has become one of the most successful and influential heavy metal bands in history, with over 100 million albums sold worldwide. The band's name was chosen by Harris, who was inspired by the torture device, or more precisely, by the film adaptation of The Man in the Iron Mask, which reminded him of the Iron Maiden. There's a certain poetry, in the fact that one of the most famous names in music comes from a device that never existed. The band Iron Maiden has done more to keep the myth alive than perhaps any other cultural force. Their albums, merchandise, and stage shows feature the iconic image of Eddie, their mascot, often depicted in or emerging from an Iron Maiden. For millions of fans around the world, the name Iron Maiden is synonymous with heavy metal, but it's also a constant reminder of the fictional torture device. Interestingly, the band has been largely unconcerned with the historical accuracy of their namesake. In interviews, band members have acknowledged that the device may have been a myth, but they've also noted that the legend is powerful regardless of its factual basis. And they're right. The Iron Maiden may be a fake, but the idea of it is real. It has real cultural power, real emotional resonance, and a real place in the collective imagination. The band has tapped into that power, and in doing so, they've ensured that the Iron Maiden will remain a cultural icon for generations to come. Debunking the myth, the work of historians. In recent years, a growing number of historians have taken up the task of debunking the Iron Maiden myth and other medieval torture myths. Their work has been painstakingly detailed, relying on careful examination of primary sources, material culture, and museum collections. And slowly, their findings are beginning to filter into the public consciousness. One key figure in this effort is Wolfgang Schild, whose 2000 book Die Eiserne Jungfrau, Dichtung und Wahrheit, The Iron Maiden, Poetry and Truth, systematically dismantles the evidence for the device's existence. Schild argues that what we call Iron Maidens were actually composite objects, assembled in the 19th century from unrelated medieval artifacts. He traces the evolution of the myth from its origins in 18th century literature through its popularization in 19th century museums to its current status as a cultural icon. His work has been highly influential among academic historians, though it remains largely unknown to the general public. Another important contribution has come from medieval historian Peter Konieczny, the editor of Medieval Warfare magazine. Konieczny has written extensively about the myths surrounding medieval torture, arguing that the period has been unfairly associated with elaborate torture devices that never existed. He notes that most of the myths about medieval torture arose in the 1700s and 1800s, when people were motivated to see the people of the past as more brutal than those of the modern day. In other words, the myths serve an ideological purpose. They make us feel good about ourselves by making our ancestors look bad. Konieczny and other scholars have pointed out that the real history of medieval torture, while certainly unpleasant, is much less sensational than the popular myths would suggest. Torture was used in the Middle Ages, but it was generally regulated by law, restricted in its application, and subject to various safeguards, at least in theory. The image of the medieval dungeon filled with exotic torture devices, the Iron Maiden, the Pair of Anguish, the Chastity Belt, is largely a product of the Victorian imagination, not a reflection of historical reality. The Chastity Belt myth. The Iron Maiden is not the only medieval myth to involve a metal device allegedly used to control human bodies. The medieval chastity belt is another classic example of a supposed medieval artifact that is almost certainly a later invention. The medieval chastity belt is typically described as a metal device worn by women to prevent sexual intercourse. It consists of a metal girdle with a padlock, often lined with cloth or leather to prevent chafing. In the popular culture, it's presented as a symbol of male jealousy and control, a medieval invention designed to ensure a wife's fidelity while her husband was away. The problem is that there's no reliable evidence that chastity belts were used during the medieval period. The earliest references appear in the 15th century, but these are highly dubious and may be jokes or satires rather than descriptions of actual practice. The first physical examples of chastity belts date from the 18th and 19th centuries, not the Middle Ages, and they were likely made as curiosities or as props for museums and exhibitions, not as functional devices for actual use. Most historians of medieval Europe regard the chastity belt as a myth, a product of the Victorian era's fascination with medieval sexuality and its desire to imagine the past as both more primitive and more perverse than the present. Like the Iron Maiden, the chastity belt serves a narrative function. It reinforces the idea that the Middle Ages were a time of barbarism, ignorance, and cruelty, in contrast to the enlightened, civilized modern world. And, like the Iron Maiden, the chastity belt continues to be displayed in museums as if it were authentic. The desire to believe in these myths, it seems, is stronger than the evidence against them. The spread of the myth through popular culture. The Iron Maiden myth has been remarkably successful in permeating popular culture. It appears in movies, television shows, video games, comic books, and literature, often presented as a historical fact without any acknowledgement of the controversy surrounding it. In cinema, the Iron Maiden has made memorable appearances in films like The Pit and the Pendulum, 1961, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1939, and The Princess Bride, 1987. In the latter film, the Iron Maiden, called The Machine, or The Pit of Despair, plays a crucial role in the plot, as the villain Count Rugen uses it to torture the hero Wesley. The film presents the device as a standard piece of medieval torture equipment, and audiences accepted it without question. In television, the Iron Maiden has appeared in episodes of The Simpsons, South Park, SpongeBob SquarePants, and countless other shows, usually as a visual shorthand for cruelty or medieval barbarism. In video games, Iron Maidens appear as obstacles, traps, or story elements in games like Castlevania, Diablo, Resident Evil, and Assassin's Creed. In each case, the device is presented as authentic, contributing to the collective belief in its existence. In literature, the Iron Maiden appears in everything from young adult fiction to horror novels to historical romance. Again, usually without any acknowledgement of its dubious authenticity. Even in works that aspire to historical accuracy, the Iron Maiden often appears as a background detail. Just another piece of medieval furniture, as unremarkable to the characters as it is horrifying to the modern reader. This ubiquity in the popular culture makes the Iron Maiden seem real. We've seen it so many times, in so many different contexts, that it's hard to believe it could all be based on a hoax. The weight of repetition, what psychologists might call the illusory truth effect, convinces us that something must be true, simply because we've heard it so many times. The moral of the story. What does the Iron Maiden myth teach us about history and how we understand it? Several lessons stand out. First, it teaches us to be skeptical of what we see in museums. Museum exhibits are created by human beings with human biases, and they're not always accurate. Just because something is on display doesn't mean it's authentic. especially when it comes to popular attractions like torture museums, which have a strong incentive to prioritize spectacle over accuracy. We should approach the exhibits with a critical eye. Second, it teaches us that our image of the past is often shaped more by our present needs and desires than by the evidence. The Iron Maiden myth flourished because it served a purpose. It made 19th century Europeans feel superior to their medieval ancestors, and it continues to make us feel superior to the supposedly barbaric people of the past. We want to believe that we're better than they were, and the Iron Maiden helps us believe it. Third, it teaches us that historical myths are hard to kill. Once a story takes hold, it can persist for centuries, surviving countless refutations and rebuttals. The Iron Maiden has been debunked repeatedly by multiple scholars working in multiple countries, using multiple lines of evidence. And yet, the myth remains. It's a testament to the power of narrative, of a good story, well told, that resonates with our deepest fears and desires. Fourth, it teaches us that the line between history and fiction is often blurrier than we'd like to admit. The Iron Maiden began as a story, was turned into an object, and then became a historical fact through the magic of repetition and belief. In a very real sense, the Iron Maiden is as real as we want it to be, not as a medieval torture device, but as a cultural artifact, a symbol, a story that we continue to tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. The future of the myth. Will the Iron Maiden myth ever die? Probably not completely. The device has become too deeply embedded in our culture to be removed by scholarly arguments alone. As long as torture museums continue to display Iron Maidens, as long as movies and TV shows include them as props, as long as the heavy metal band keeps its name, the myth will persist. But there are signs that attitudes are changing. In recent years, some museums have begun to update their exhibits, acknowledging the controversial nature of the artifacts they display. The Museum of Us in San Diego, for example, has an Iron Maiden in its collection, but it presents it with contextual information about its 19th century origin and the myths surrounding it. Other museums have followed suit, adding labels that explain the device's history, not as a medieval torture tool, but as a 19th century object created to satisfy public demand for sensational exhibits. Historians continue to write about the myth, and popular media have begun to take notice. Articles and documentaries debunking the Iron Maiden have appeared in major publications and on reputable websites, reaching audiences beyond the academic world. Slowly, the truth is spreading. It's likely that the Iron Maiden will remain a fascinating object for the foreseeable future, not as a genuine medieval torture device, but as an example of how historical myths are created, perpetuated, and eventually sometimes corrected. The device tells us not about the Middle Ages, but about the people who invented it, their fears, their prejudices, their desire to feel superior to the past, and their willingness to believe the most sensational stories without question. In that sense, the Iron Maiden is more valuable as a historical artifact than it would be if it were authentic. It's a window into the 19th century mind, a testament to the power of storytelling, and a warning about the dangers of uncritical belief. The Iron Maiden never killed anyone, but as a myth, it has shaped the way millions of people understand the past, and that's a kind of power that even the most brutal torture device could never match. The Iron Maiden is a spectacular invention, a masterpiece of dark imagination, one of the most effective hoaxes in all of history, It never existed in the Middle Ages. It was never used to torture or kill anyone, and all of the surviving examples are either 19th century forgeries or modern reproductions. And yet, it has become one of the most recognized and feared symbols of medieval cruelty in the world. We should stop calling the Iron Maiden a medieval torture device, because it's not. But we shouldn't stop talking about it. The story of the Iron Maiden, who invented it, why, and how the myth spread, is fascinating in its own right, and it teaches us valuable lessons about how history works, how myths are made, and how our image of the past is shaped by the present. The Iron Maiden is not real, but the desire to believe in it, that's as real as it gets. And in that sense, the Iron Maiden may be the most authentic torture device of all. It's a mirror reflecting our own fears, our own need for stories that make sense of a complicated world, our own longing for a past that justifies the present. The spikes may be fake, but the impulse that created them, that impulse is all too human, all too real, and it's not going anywhere. So the next time you see an Iron Maiden in a museum or on a screen, remember, you're not looking at a window into the Middle Ages. You're looking at a window into the 19th century, and into ourselves. And that, perhaps, is even more disturbing,